so pleased to be here today with Dr. Bernice King and Mayor Michael Tubbs. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Mayor Tubbs, I want to start by asking you about your Universal Basic Income program. You launched it in 2018, and I understand it's just been extended into 2021 with the pandemic. You know, for those of our viewers who may not know too much about UBI, can you just explain a bit about how it works?
Yeah, I remember first reading about UBI when I was in college over a decade ago and reading Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos Our Community, Dr. King Sr.'s last book. I remember reading about how he talked about how the simplest way to abolish poverty was in fact the most direct. I remember reading that and being very interested in like what happened to this idea. I have not heard anyone speak about this as part of his legacy. And then fast forward to when I became mayor of Stockton, I told my staff to look at like how are we going to get rid of poverty in our community? And they came back with this idea of giving people money. And honestly, at first I was a little bit nervous. It felt like a very bold, a very radical, a little bit of a crazy idea. But essentially how it works is that it's a cash transfer. So citizens are given a specified amount of dollars every single month with no conditions as to how that money is to be used. So in the Stockton pilot, we've randomly selected 125 families to be given $500 a month for the last 18 months. And then luckily through the philanthropy, but heartbreakingly because of the economic crisis this pandemic has wrought, we've been able to extend the program to go to January as it was slated to end in July.
And so you're also a founding member of Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, which is a coalition of mayors who are advocating for a guaranteed income. What about this current moment or about the Stockton pilot has convinced other mayors to get on board? Mayors like Eric Garcetti in LA and Keisha Bottoms-Lance in Atlanta. What's convinced them to get on board?
I think it's just the moment we're in. When we see how COVID-19 has exposed just the fault lines of our democracy. But then you also consider just the civil unrest we're seeing in our streets everywhere in this country. And the civil unrest is not just because of the horrors of the violence of police brutality, but it's really protests just around structural racism, the violence of white supremacy, and the violence of poverty in our society. And I think just harkening back to Reverend King, the fact that when he wrote Where Do We Go From Here? It was written in a context similar to this one, where folks were in the streets, folks were protesting, folks were raising holy hell. And he had the foresight even then to say, well, this is something that's needed to meet the moment. So I think it's just a moment we're in where people are really grappling with how the old way wasn't working, hasn't been working, it won't work in the future. And that's on us as leaders to follow the moral leadership of folks like Reverend Bernice King and do what is necessary to provide for our people and provide for all people during this time.
Right. Well, Dr. King, can you tell us a bit about why you joined the fight for UBI?
Well, I won't say I joined it. I will just say that it's been a part of my my legacy. It's been a part of the work that we do at the King Center, and it's an extension of what my mother did. She did, in fact, Mayor Tubbs talk about it during her lifetime. My brother and I have spoken about it. Of course, we're not elected officials. And so this is anything that continues my father's legacy, I endorse, I support. And in fact, when I heard about it, I reached out to Mayor Tubbs on IG and commended him on the work that he's doing, because somebody has to be bold enough and courageous enough to take a step in that direction. And I'm glad that he had the foresight to invite others to join in that struggle. And my hope is that, we will find a way for the gap to be addressed, not only from a governmental side, but even from a corporate side, because I think the corporate community has a role and responsibility as well in helping us to address all of these economic inequalities that we have in our society.
Well, interesting. Well, I'm curious, what are your thoughts about what should come next for UBI, Dr. King?
Well, I think it's important that more pilots be done in other cities, because you have to build up the confidence of the nation, and you got to get that critical mass to understand it, so that then we can leverage that to begin to put the pressure on the federal government to address it, and hopefully find creative ways to bring in corporate America to assist with this as well. For instance, one of the things that my father talked about in the appendix of his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, dealing with the employment side. At that time, he was talking about providing on-the-job training instead of training and then hiring. We hired them, trained them on the job for whatever new jobs exist. So they're paid essentially from the day that they are being trained, and that corporations would essentially get some sort of a benefit, a tax credit, we would say today. I think there are so many ways for corporate America to begin to expand their ranks and begin to hire people and even in the tech industry. As we know, there's a big chasm. There's a digital divide. There are a lot of Blacks and other minority groups that are not prepared to work those tech jobs. So there's a way to provide funding even for them to be trained for those jobs. So, these are some of the things that I'd like to see happen if we're going to begin to address, poverty holistically, and not just merely by the federal guidelines, because they are very low as far as I'm concerned.
Mayor Tubbs, I'm curious, I mean, the advantages of UBI are pretty obvious. What have been some of the challenges of implementing this, and what do you see as challenges for other cities that might also try their own pilot programs?
I think the challenges were just what Reverend King articulated, in that it challenges some of the basic tenets that folks hold as to how this country operates. So there's a lot of people that believe that if you work in America, you make enough money to provide for your families. When the fact is, in 99% of the counties in this country, if you make minimum wage, you cannot afford rent for an apartment without being rent for it. A lot of people really believe that effort determines outcomes, that if you were working hard and if you weren't lazy, that you would have enough to meet basic necessities, when that's not the case. A lot of people believed that everyone who worked was getting paid, when we know that women do all type of work, particularly in the home with caregiving, domestic work, etc. And they're not compensated for that labor and that work. So a lot of it has been challenging these ideas about how the economy works, and challenging the ideas of how wealth has been created in this country, that it hasn't just been hard work that's created wealth. Reverend King talked about how in American history there were things given to people, like land grants, given to folks to settle the West and to create colleges and things of that sort. So that's been the hardest part. It's really kind of pushing back on myths, and also, again, showing that this concept is actually American. This is how we built prosperity and built wealth and create opportunity for certain groups of people. But we know, given the history of this country, that people of color, and in particular Black people, have historically been excluded from all the ways that the government has provided not a handout, but really a hand up, and really an opportunity for people to work hard, an opportunity for people to be entrepreneurial, an opportunity to help kind of even the playing field, so that then we can really look at effort as determining ability or outcomes.
There's been a newfound understanding in this country about systemic racism, and a lot of discussion about whether the approaches to addressing it, to what degree should they be race neutral and what degree should they be more pinpointed. Obviously, UBI is a race neutral approach. I'm curious, how do you view this discussion? I mean, what role is there for race neutral policy and for pinpointed policies that address these systemic issues head on?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. So I think, again, part of Dr. King's genius was understanding, as the civil rights movement continued to move forward, that part of it was bringing a broad coalition of class-based interests that would help Black people in particular, but not Black people exclusively. And I think that has to be part of the solution, just universal programs, but also that we also have to have targeted interventions to specific harms. We know that in every institution, from housing to healthcare to even the discipline given to 4-year-old girls in nursery schools, that Black people are disproportionately face worse outcomes, and not because of the actions of Black people, but because of institutionalized racism, right? And there definitely has to be a discussion of a specific race-based policies to rectify some of these race-based outcomes. So I think it's absolutely a both and. I think this moment demands us to do both of those things. And I've actually, one of the great things about the moment we're in now, in my opinion, is that we can have a conversation seriously about HR 40. And they need to have a serious conversation in this country about reparations. So I'm in complete support of policies that benefit everyone. I'm also in support for policies that address specific harm done by government to certain groups. And I also think by even being that specific, you actually do help everyone, because when everyone does better, everyone really does do better.
I want to say, first of all, I agree with everything he said 100%. And just to add, something that my father mentioned is that when a nation has done something against a group of people, it must also do something for a group of people. And so in terms of the targeted race-based, I know that California recently is placing on their ballot in November the restoration of affirmative action. And we may need to revisit that across the country. We have to be careful that we're not so neutral as we've been for the last several, I mean, maybe a couple of decades, and allow the gap to continue to widen in terms of the Black community, because the data is there. The disparities in every area indicate that we are the bottom and the last. And if there's not something specifically targeted, it's going to get worse. And so I would say, if you had to do the scales, that it would be weighted heavily towards targeted, and yet also, as he said, that it be neutral as well. I'm seriously concerned about where we are in terms of the Black community. The numbers economically have not changed since 1968. I mean, the wealth gap it's basically the same.
Well, I want to ask just you specifically, Dr. King, oftentimes a quote from your father, about wanting his kids to be judged on the content of their character and not the color of their skin is taken out of context to suggest, that we shouldn't have policies that really deal with race specifically. And I just, for the sake of people who might want to use that out of context, I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts about that quote in this context.
Well, you have to understand, first of all, when he spoke that part of his speech, that was the ideal and the hope that we would get to a place in our nation where not just his children, obviously, we were symbolic of all generations of people, will not, and that Black people in particular would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's the goal we want to get to. So that in order to get to that goal, though, we have to recognize the things he talked about previously in his speech, the bounce check that he talked about in particular. And, the fact of the matter is, we can't even speak of that standard of equality until there's equity. And for those of us in the Black community, there's not equity because of all of the historic oppression, exploitation, and et cetera. And so I would say to people that when my father was saying that, he was essentially saying, we can't ignore race. We should not ignore race, but we should not use it as a basis to judge people on their abilities and their talents, their gifts, et cetera. So that's the way I would address it, essentially.
One thing that I think a lot about, and I think I personally think is underrepresented in this conversation, is the role of environmental justice. The way that environmental racism has really made it difficult for people of color and Black people specifically. That includes everything from exposure to lead poisoning to being more likely to be in a flood zone. And I know, Mayor Tubbs, you are working on an initiative in Stockton just on this issue, and I'd just be curious to hear a bit about that. How are you tackling environmental racism?
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. So I think part of the tenure of our conversation has been just this idea that every single facet of American life that has an institution has been infected with the disease of racism. And when you look at environmental injustice, it's not an accident that Black folks and Latino folks are more likely to get COVID-19 and more likely to die from COVID-19 because they're also most likely to live in communities with high rates of asthma because of environmental toxins in the air, because they're close to freeways. They're more likely to have diabetes because they live in communities with no grocery stores and more liquor stores and lack of safe spaces to play and lack of trees and green spaces. So part of the work we're doing in Stockton, in addition to a guaranteed income, is making sure that King's dream is true in all facets of our community. So part of that's also addressing environmental racism. So we've been working with our state government and just received a $10 million grant for something called Rise Stockton, which is a community-led effort to begin to address these issues of environmental racism that have been caused by city planning decisions made by elected officials like me and commissions about what goes where and things of that sort, which will include planting more trees, and which will include what Reverend King talked about in terms of training people for the jobs in the green economy, so that as we transition to new and alternative energies, that the folks who were most disproportionately impacted from the bad toxins and the bad environmental practices stand to benefit in their health, but also in their pocketbooks, because we know that that one's economic state also influences their health outcomes, so that they're able to give access to those jobs and kind of build a foundation for their next generations.
One final question to both of you. I'm curious whether you're hopeful that this moment will bring systemic change and that will actually, as a society, address systemic racism.
I'm cautiously optimistic. And I say cautiously because it always seems that when we get to these moments, there's an initial momentum and things kind of fall off and quiet down and people revert back to their comfort zones. But I'm optimistic this time, in spite of that, because of conversations that I've had behind the scenes with people who sit in seats of influence and power and can make a difference and a change by the questions that they ask, like, what can we do? How can we begin the process? These are questions that I've never heard before, inquiries that have not been made previously. And also just by the sheer numbers of people who joined in some of the outcry in the last several weeks since it's all started. You're dealing with a much more diverse crowd now. When we started back in 2014, it was majority Black. Now it seems like it's majority white saying Black Lives Matter. And so, yes, I am cautiously optimistic, and I'm doing my part so that we don't lose the momentum and people do not revert back, but they do make not just incremental changes, but that there are efforts to be deliberate and intentional in the giving that will actually make a significant difference in the racial disparities, and also to shift our nation to a different foundation, that we no longer operate from this white supremacy foundation, which I know is going to take a lot of work, a lot of hard work. Hopefully this time next year, we'll be having a conversation that talks about the substantial progress that we've made.
Yeah, I think just looking at Reverend King's example and example of her parents, it's an idea that we are one of my mentors, Mary Wright Elderman, she told me that it was a privilege to struggle for justice and that it's a relay. So again, understanding that given we're talking about something that started over 400 years ago, which doesn't give us an excuse to not do anything in the present, but it does at least give me a little bit of context of just how long we've been grappling with this, and how it's an opportunity now in this moment to leverage the opportunity, where you have more people who look like us in seats of power or in proximity to those with the influence and ability to make a change, and how looking back at sort of the work that Rev. King's done herself or her parents has done, and how they did that work in even bleaker circumstances, even more difficult times, in times they look even more hopeless. I think for me, gives me a lot of energy. And then as a parent of an 8-month-old, I just refuse to have my son grow up his entire life in a country that views him as dangerous, that will determine that his life outcomes will be determined not by who he is or what he does, but by the fact that his parents happen to be Black. So that gives me a little more energy, a lot more passion, and I do think, because it's not just Black folks saying that something has to change. Like I tell people all the time, if it was up to Black people to end racism, we wouldn't been done 400 years ago. We have never been like, racism is cool. Racism has never worked for us. So the fact that we have a multi-generational and multi-ethnic coalition saying we demand change. And the last thing I'll say, Justin, is that, again, I know Reverend King, your dad talked about reading The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire and how just the signs of decay of society. I think COVID-19 has really illustrated just how fragile our society is. And if we don't make a change, there's a very real probability that we won't exist, or we won't exist with the same sort of international stature as we've had as a country for the past 200 years. Like, this is now an issue of national security. It's an issue of self-interest for us to get this right. I think all those factors and the many good people everywhere pushing and fighting make me cautiously optimistic and ever hopeful that we'll continue to fight and create the society that we deserve to live in.
Great note to end on. Thank you both for taking the time. Really appreciate you coming here today. Thank you.